while this thing is doing its thing. Yeah, we should be good over on this side. And like I mentioned, essentially, we're going to be continuing a conversation that we started last session about leveraging data, changing data in React components. And so one of the things we talked about last session, if you recall, was we started this conversation about an interesting aspect of working with React called props. And props are essentially data objects that you can pass into your React components from a parent component. So we talked a little bit about what it meant to be a parent component to another component, right? So in essence, any component that gets rendered in the React DOM is part of a big tree of components. And the component that ends up rendering another component, we call a parent component. So if we look back at this app.js, right, here's an example of us rendering some components in the app.js. We have a hello component and we have a message component. And what we would say is that the app component is the parent component to this hello component and this message component, because the app component is the one that eventually renders both of those other custom components. If these components weren't connected to the app, we wouldn't see them at all. They would just be some regular files that had some information, but the information wasn't actually being utilized in any kind of specific or special way. Props are data objects that you create and pass into components as they're being rendered. So from this example of the app component, we have these two components, like I mentioned, hello and message. And we talked a little bit about how we can pass data into these components that the components can use as they're deciding what they want, what they're responsible for rendering. And that's really what props are. So props get created from the parent component in this moment of rendering where we say, hey, I want to render a component called hello to the DOM. And I want that component to have a specific prop called date. And date is just going to be an object with some data inside of it that is going to get passed. And similarly for the message component, we created two props. One was a content called content that was a string, and one was sender, which is also a string. So whenever you're thinking about data and like making use of specific data from within a component, you're going to want to think about props for one as data that you can pass into a component. The thing that makes props very unique is that props can't be changed. The component that is getting the props, receiving the props, cannot change them. They can just access them and use them as kind of like read-only variables. They can't change the props and set it equal to something else, but they can read the value of these props. So here where I say, hey, the content is going to be equal to yo, 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 that means that this particular message component, when it's rendering, will have access to some prop called content that it can make use of while it's rendering. And then if we take a look back at kind of what we were doing last class, we see that we were playing around with utilizing these props in our rendering stage. So here, when this component is rendering, we see that it's definitely making use of the props.content that I just mentioned. And it does some creative stuff with that props.content object as well, which is utilize it to create this kind of conditional rendering where it says, based on the value of this particular thing, I'm going to show this, or I'm going to show something else. So if this.props.content exists, I'm going to show something in this div. Otherwise, I'm just going to return something that says, hey, this prop has no, this component has no prop for content. And when we take a look at the app that we worked on the other day, that's exactly what we see, right? So we see that some of these components have specific props. They have the content prop and the sender prop, and then others only have one of those props. So this one only has the content prop, but no sender prop. And then some of them have no prop at all. And that was kind of our exercise to play around with understanding how to pass these data to different components and see in essence what we can do with data that's passed into the React components as they're rendering. We also talked a little bit about class-based components again, and I was mentioning that class-based components are essentially the same as functional components, except they have access to a number of different methods that are just tied to them. So the constructor is one of them, and the render function is another one of them. These two methods are defined for us, and we just have to implement them in our own way. So it's required for us to pass some return statement of JSX to our render statement, and we use that to basically tell this component what is going to show up on the page. So today I thought we would keep talking a little bit about this process of sharing data from within components, and also kind of extend it by way of talking about another way that you can use and manipulate data within your React components. So that basically where we're going to go is from talking about props and the ways in which we can pass data into a component to another type of data that's more related to components changing data internally and as they go. And like we mentioned earlier, props you can't change. So what happens when you have data that you want to change? Well, that's a great use case for another type of data object in React that we call state. State is data that can change from within a component, and the component has access to it to use in unique creative ways as the component is doing its job of rendering content. So again, everything we're going to be talking about is found in the React docs. If you go to reactjs.org, go to the docs, go to main concepts, and take a look at, so last session, we kind of were talking about components and props. This session, we're going to talk a little bit more about state and lifecycle. So yeah, that's where you can go if you want to kind of get some more detailed notes on what we're going to be talking about in a couple of seconds. But awesome. So we have kind of this preface of knowing how to work with our components in unique ways. So what I'm going to do is pull up in DS Studio Code, the code that we worked on for our components app that is running right now. So I'm just going to use that VS Code shortcut that I showed y'all a couple of sessions ago. To open this project real quick. Cool. And boom. All right, so we got these files opened up. And these files are the same ones on GitHub. I apologize if anybody had went to the GitHub and was like surprised that it hadn't updated. I pushed the code from the last session into here, so you can see all of the stuff with the props and component stuff that we passed in before. But we'll do a small little code review just to kind of get familiar with this application, what's going on with it, and then we'll start making a couple of changes. So close this. So the majority of files that you got to worry about right now are the source inside of the source directory. We've been making some changes to our app.js. We also created a couple new components. So we created a components folder that is housing 2 new components that we're working with. One of those components is a functional component, just to kind of show the point of how you can really easily create new components in React by way of defining them as functional components. But the majority of what we're going to be talking about, especially for today's class, is class-based components, which are similar in function. I don't want to say function. Similar in responsibility as functional components, but the difference between a functional component and a class-based component is classes are their own specific type of object in React, and functions are also their own specific type of objects in JavaScript, I should say. And the unique thing about classes is what I've mentioned earlier, that classes make use of, they inherit from a specific base class called the React component that has a number of different functions that we can make use of inside of our class. The 2 that we've been talking about so far are the constructor as well as the render function. These are two functions that come in every class-based component, and you're able to use them to fit your needs with whatever it is you're trying to do content-wise with your React application. So essentially all we did last class was we created these two components and we started messing around with this idea of using props. We talked about, hey, if I create one component, I might want to be able to use that component strategically multiple times, right? And instead of having to create one component that for each time I want to show something on the screen, maybe it makes sense to create a customizable component, right? A component that maybe I pass some data into it, and based on the data that I pass in, it shows different things. And that's exactly what we use props to do, is to pass into a component specific information that might be helpful for the component. And then we can use that specific information. So for instance, like this content or sender prop inside of the component to then do unique things like render a specific type of element, or render nothing at all. And the process of making decisions based on the data that is given to the component in these kind of conditional like settings is called conditional rendering. And conditional rendering is a big skill that you're going to be able to get more familiar with as we work on more React-based projects and using the JavaScript in general. But the main concept of it is, instead of having something just return, like have one functional component, kind of like this functional component just really clearly returns, even though this is using props, it's just returning. But the idea of conditional rendering is based on whatever's inside of the props, you render one thing or you render something else. Even this can be extended because not every hello component might have a date passed into it. And if it doesn't, we don't want our program not to just not show anything. We want to actually show something helpful for us to know. And that process is called conditional rendering, of determining based on some condition, what do I show? So that's kind of a recap of where we're at with this project right now. Nothing too crazy. The app is still kind of basic in terms of what it's showing off. We just have a couple new components that we've been playing with that were meant to really kind of help us understand the process of using props to pass data into our children components from the parent component. So props, again, super important topic. We're going to talk a lot about it in general for the next few weeks, but I want to talk about a different type of use case, right? A use case in which something inside of the component might change over time, and we want to respond to that change. So if you think about going to any website, right? Like maybe see if on GitHub I can think of a good example. Maybe if I go back to our main kind of page here, right? Here we see the main default kind of GitHub repository page for this repository I've been working on for demonstrating this process of using props, right? And one of the features of GitHub is that based on how you structure your repository, you might end up creating what we call branches. And branches are essentially a tool of GitHub and Git to help you segment your code to almost kind of create isolated sandboxes of your code that you can edit over time. So right now we've been making use of one branch, which is our main branch, to make all of our changes on our Git repository. But sometimes what happens in the real practical context of you working with Git is that you're going to create multiple branches, because you might use your main branch only to maybe change when like big things in your project are being finished. But you might have another branch that you might be using to work off of, and you change things more frequently, but you might not be releasing those things to the main branch, for instance. And that's kind of a common use case that we have in general, is to have different branches that you can use with regards to your code and to your kind of projects. So Right now, I only have one branch, but real quickly, just to kind of show you an idea of this process of where something like state might come in handy, right? Is say, for instance, I create a new branch. So the command to create a new branch in Git is git checkout -b with the name of the branch that you're going to create. So I'm just going to real quick create a new branch in Git on my local computer. So for this local repository, remember with Git, there's the local repository, which is the one that's housed on your, the like actual files housed in your computer in some folder. And once you make changes here, you're going to want to also have those changes reflect on your larger kind of remote branch, your remote repository. And so to do that, we add the changes and then we end up pushing the changes up to our remote branch. So what I'm going to do is just push these changes up so that in essence, when I now refresh here on the remote, I have two branches. I just wanted you to see this kind of process of two branches. Now, the whole purpose of branching in Git is so that in one case, there's code that is related to one branch that's all on, it's only, each branch has kind of its own history of what's going on that branch. So you can make changes on the main branch all you want, but that change is not going to affect this new branch that we made called development. And development has maybe the same files, right? But if you can imagine how a team might work, they might be working on separate branches, making different changes. And it's only when they're really ready to push to kind of merge each other's changes into one branch that then they start collaborating again, right? And so we use branches like for that purpose in GitHub, where you have these isolated kind of environments to work off of. Different folks can work on different branches. And then ultimately at some point, you're gonna merge the changes together to the same branch, or you're gonna pull changes from one branch into another branch. And that's typically what happens in a more professional, collaborative, project-based environment. But that's, we're going to talk a lot more about Git in that process in a couple of sessions. But the whole point I wanted to show you was, so take a look at this website now. Now I'm on the same website, right? But clearly I have this option to kind of toggle between being on the main branch, right? And on the main branch, I see something specific that is related to the kind of branch that's here. And then I can switch to the development branch, right? And the hope would be that the development branch would be a little bit different than the branch on main, right? Like that main would hold its own code and development would hold its own code. But you can think of it like on this same website, right? I'm kind of seeing two different scenarios. One is the case that I'm on this main branch, and I might want to see something on this case, which is show me whatever I need to see because I'm on main. And then I might say, oh, well, now I'm no longer on main, I'm on development, and I want to see what's related to development. This might be a good use case for something like state in React, where we can basically think of this website having two states. The state that you're on main and you're looking at main, and when state is equal to us being on main, maybe I want to see something specific here, versus the state that I'm on development. And now no, it's a different state. I'm looking at development. So I might want to see something different. State in React is all about data that is going to be changing. And when it changes, you can respond to those changes as well. So I just show you this as an example of, most websites have some aspect of data that changes based on some interaction, right? Every time I change on this drop down and choose a different thing, clearly the state of the web page will change, right? The state of what branch I'm looking at changes. The cool thing about working in JavaScript and working on the web in general is that there's all types of things that can trigger the state of your web application to change. And the thing that really becomes those points of triggers are also typically useful in the case of us working with events. So we talked about events when we first built that tic-tac-toe game, right? We used the on-click event to handle when a user was clicking on the board and changing things, right? So the interesting thing about JavaScript is that JavaScript can respond to the different HTML events that are triggered on our web pages. So that's things like, the page finishes loading, but also things like somebody's typing in an input box or a button is being clicked, right? These are all actions that end up eventually changing the elements on our web page, as well as, if you can think of it in this broader sense, the state of a running application. With tic-tac-toe, the state might have been like reflected in the board. The board was changing over time. And in general, when we use JavaScript, we're normally changing things based on these bigger events that are happening on the web page. And so this idea of state with React, which we're going to talk a little bit about in general, is all about kind of elements that are going to be changing over time and our components responding to those changes, and also being able to change that data themselves. So a good example that they use in the React docs about like a use case for using state is in building something like a timer, right? So here they're talking through a couple of different steps. We're going to skip some of this conversation, but I definitely encourage you to take a look at it. But the idea here is, I wonder if they show actually an example of the timer running. Do they or do they not? It's kind of funny. Okay, I guess they don't want to show it to us. I'd probably have to open it in like CodePen or something. It's cool. We'll see our own examples. But in essence, the idea is that our components might want to respond to changes over time based on things happening on the web page. So let's take a look at that and kind of see a little bit more of what I mean and why state and managing state in React can be very helpful. So we're going to kind of just continue to hack on this application. First thing I'm going to do is just come back in here and kind of clean things up a little bit. Now that I have a new branch that I just created, I'm actually going to work off that new branch a little bit more and make use of it. I think I'm looking at the wrong. So I made this development branch, but I think this might not be the right. Let me just reopen this real quick. I'm just gonna start making some changes to this application so that we can kind of give ourselves a little fresh start and maybe work on a different application in general. We kind of can retire these other components, the hello and message component. Matter of fact, what I'm going to do to make this a little bit more clean is I'm going to create a new folder in here. I'm going to call these other components that we were working with before. Let's say for props. And then I'll move these files in there because we're not using those anymore. Yes. Cool. And then I'm just going to create another set of components to work with in a few, but for right now, I'm going to just make some changes to the app.js just get back to kind of a point of having kind of like an empty sandbox to work with. So I'm just going to delete all the stuff that's inside of there. And I'm going to say, just kind of make a little div that says, hey, fresh start. Excuse me. So fresh start, save this. Believe the app is still running on that server. So boom, cool. So clearly back to kind of like a blank canvas, got this little text saying, hey, fresh start at the top. You might not be able to see it, but it's right there at the top. And essentially what we're going to just do is kind of just build out another application using React right now. So talking about props, right? We're talking about data that's going to be changing over time. State is a little different. Excuse me. When we talk about props, we're talking about data that's passed into a component that can't change, right? Once the component receives it, it cannot change. But with state, we might be wanting some data internal to the component that does change. So let's take a look at an application that has that kind of scenario where something's going to happen that changes something about the running state of the application. So I'll keep this app here, but let's just make a new component that is called, let's say new file. Let's make a new component that's called, let's call it mood.js. So if I want to make a new component, I'm going to call it mood. So this component is going to be responsible for showing a message based on users' mood, right? So first thing we're going to want to do is kind of create a new component. And so again, we talked a little bit about functional components and how simple they are, but I really encourage you to try your best to get experience working with these class-based components. And we're going to see why working with the class-based component is going to be super helpful for us in general for working with state in a couple of seconds. So I'm going to actually make this a class-based component. So what I'm going to have to do is at the top, I'm going to have to import React from React. And that's just getting the React library from the React package that we installed when we did our first Create React app. Then I'm going to kind of start defining out this class. So I'm going to say class mood extends React.component. So remember, we're accessing this component library. This component base class from the React library. So we're using this dot to say, hey, inside of the React library, there's a specific class called component that's in there that we're gonna make use of right now. So this is just kind of the general syntax you got to use for defining a new class. And then the only thing that classes are expected to return or expected to do is to create a render function that is able to return some JSX. So just like in a functional component, we just have to return whatever we want to see on the screen. So right now, I'm just going to return a div, just real simple to say, this is my mood component so that I can test it. So I have my render statement. This is all good. And then the last step is to export what we wrote in this particular file. So I'm going to say export default mood. And cool. Now I have this new class-based component. So very simple, not too crazy. I think the biggest thing to get used to is just syntax for writing a class for the component, extending the React dot component. And in order to do that, we have to import the React library. But now that we have this new component, next thing I want to do is inside of the app.js is I'm going to comment these out right now. But inside of the app.js, I'm going to import our mood component from /components/mood. So again, remember, you don't have to put the .js at the end. It just infers that because you're importing that you're looking for a JavaScript file with this name. So one of the things VS Code does is when you import something that's not currently being used, it'll kind of like make it a little like it changes the opacity so that you can see like, hey, clearly something is up here. When you highlight over, it says, hey, this is declared, but its value's never read, which is just a helpful thing that VS Code does to just remind us, hey, you might want to use this thing that you just imported. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So instead of having this, hey, fresh start kind of thing here, just going to swap that with the mood component that we just built and save that. So now that I'm using it, you can see that this kind of gets a nice color back to it. And then if I go back, clearly my apps changed from using the that old copy to saying, hey, this is my mood component, which is great. So now that I'm kind of connecting in this mood component into my app, right, I can start using a couple of things. I can, make this mood component a little bit more robust. If I wanted to or felt the need to, I can pass some props from the app component down into the mood component. But as of right now, I don't really see why I might want props. I kind of want to just make a simple app that asks the user, like, how are they feeling? And based on how they're feeling, it will show a specific message of some sort. So let's start this off simple, and then we might make it a little bit more complex. So maybe for now, we give the user 2 options, and they can say, we just tell them like, hey, how are you feeling? And it says like, hey, I'm feeling good, or hey, I'm feeling not so good. And then they can kind of click that, and based on that information, it might show a specific message to them. This like cheers them up. Let's maybe call this affirmations or something. So let's figure out how we would do that, right? I'm kind of imagining in kind of a visual sense, like something like essentially like maybe we have like, whoops, it's not going to do this for me. Let's see, something like 2 buttons here, right? And then inside of those 2 buttons is a little bit of text that's like feeling good, right? And then inside of here, maybe something like feeling not so good. And then as the user kind of presses on one of these buttons, maybe there's a kind of bigger picture message somewhere up here that says, shows some message, right? And that's kind of what I'm imagining from like kind of a general kind of UI of this little small kind of component. So let's kind of just work on that, get that going, create some elements that'll make this show up. And then we'll figure out how we can kind of make it so that when these buttons are clicked, something changes in our application in terms of this message that shows up. So clear these, go back to the, I'm gonna go back to VS Code, and let's just get into it. So what I'm gonna do first is just kind of lay this out so that I have this, I have the ability to build that UI kind of like I was talking about before. So I'm gonna do, I just extended the return statement a little bit. So when you return something that is only when you return something that's 1 line, you don't need the parentheses. But when you return something that's going to be multiple lines, so even right now, this is clearly multiple lines, I need to wrap it in parentheses, just kind of best practice here. So I'm about to extend this div so that it's kind of a couple lines long, because instead of this mood component, I want to kind of build out that little UI that we just saw of the message, the buttons, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'll do inside of this div, what I'm going to do is add an element for the message. And I'm going to just, for now, I'm going to say, this is our message for our users. And then underneath that, and I'll just save it real quick so you can see what's happening. Cool, got this nice little heading, right? And remember, this is just a built-in JSX element that's tied to the same corresponding element in HTML. So now that I got that, the next thing I want is kind of just some 2 buttons that I can use for registering what the user is essentially feeling. So what I'm going to do is just use a button element, and I'm going to say feeling good. Maybe I'll add, because I'm feeling saucy like that, I'm going to add a little, if my keyboard won't spaz out on me. I wanted to add a little, oh, they won't even let me pull up my emoji keyboard. That's sad news. Oh, there it is. All right, cool. So let's add a little emoji. I'll just copy it over and then bring it into the app. Feeling good. Feel like this is feeling good. Cool. Go back in here. I don't know why it wasn't showing up right here. 1 button. I'm just gonna copy this. Feeling Let's see if it pulls up. No, it didn't pull up. So, I think, maybe this. Cool. I bet. So got our little heading going on, got some buttons. So I'll just save this, and I got my 2 buttons up here. You know, I could definitely improve the styling of this, but you know, for right now, I think this is good enough. We got our nice little message, and we got 2 buttons for our user. I'm kind of clicking on these buttons, and clearly nothing is happening. So we're gonna have to talk a little bit about connecting these buttons so that we can actually do something interesting. And what we want to do, in essence, is change this message to, based on what the user is inputting, right? So this is an interesting scenario. We have a component, right? This component right here, clearly our mood component. And based on what the user button is being clicked, right? We might want to change something internal to this component. So we might want some data to change. And previously, when we were talking about props, we talked about how maybe we can pass some data into this component, but that doesn't really help us if the props can't change, right? If the props kind of get set at once, and maybe for instance, somebody passes in, hey, I'm feeling good into this mood. Well, we could use that to maybe do some conditional rendering, but how would that work if the button was supposed to change something about this component? And so that's exactly where the limitations from using props come, and why using state is important, because state, we can actually make use of something that's going to change internal to this component. So let's take a look about how we'll wire this component up to state and set some data that is going to essentially change over time, right? So cool. So one of the interesting things, like I mentioned about working with class-based components, is that you get access to a couple of different methods out of the box. The render method is defined, and we just have to make sure we implement it by way of saying, what is this render method going to return? If we don't put a render method inside of this class, we're going to get an error that tells us, hey, like, matter of fact, let me just show you. If I tried to create this class and I didn't have a render method, right? I'm going to get this big error from React that is going to just be like, yo, what's going on here? And oops, there it is. So it says instance.render is not a function, right? So essentially this is basically coming up. This is an error that we're getting that's essentially related to the fact that when we are making use of this component mood inside of our app.js, like the app is trying to render the mood component, but the mood component doesn't have a render statement inside of it. So we're gonna get an error that says, hey, something like, this instance.render is not a function. And this method, this error isn't as easy to understand, like where it's coming from. Let's see if we scroll down a little bit to see if there was some area that would help us determine this. But I say this to say, in general, well, here you can see kind of the error was happening inside of the React app, but the app, if we traced it back, we would see that the app, we're trying to render an app component. The app component is trying to render the mood component. And so you might want to have to kind of walk back through it to see what might not be rendering correctly. And so clearly, we forced this error. So let me just put this render method back. So the render is one of those functions that's defined as a default. The other function we talked about was another function, another method that is defined on classes called the constructor, right? And the constructor is a very simple method that is defined on classes, that is the first method that runs when this class is getting created. This is like the initializer function inside of the class. So I mentioned there's only one specific thing you kind of have to do in general when you're working with classes, is create this, just run this function called super that is essentially initializes the parent class. So in this case, because we're inheriting from the React.component, writing super here is just going to instantiate and make sure that this React.component is created the right way, so our class is set up correctly. Other than that, we can do all types of stuff inside of the constructor. We can run some functions, we can set some data up, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that makes a class-based component really helpful is that you can really easily start working with state when you start with a class-based component. So one of the things that makes a functional component different than a class-based component, outside of just the trivial thing of they're just differently defined, is that on top of you being able to use a constructor and render function, et cetera, from the class-based component, you can very quickly start using state in your class-based components. Now, there's ways you can use state within a functional component, but trust me, it's just right out of the box easier to use a class-based component when you're working with state. And we talked about props last session, and I showed you how, you know, within the class-based component, we can use props, but also within the functional component, we can use props. So props are a little bit easier to deal with when it comes to like class versus functional component. But with state, it's significantly easier to use state in a class-based component. So you're going to see people using class-based components that another reason why people create class-based components is so that they can be what we call stateful components, or components with making use of state variables that are going to change over time. So let me show you how we can initialize some state variables in our component and how simple it is within a class. So in order to set up state inside of a class, inside of the constructor function is typically where we do this. We set up a new variable called this.state. In this.state, we set it equal to an object. And state in JavaScript and in React is going to be an object. And so one of the things we know about objects is that objects are key value data structures. So we have to give some key that then is tied to a corresponding value. And just thinking about this application, what might be like something that we might want to save as data that is going to change? Well, maybe it's the mood that the user commits to, right? Maybe when the mood right now, when they first come to the application, is unknown. We don't know what their mood is. But then when we do know is after they clicked one of these buttons. And once they've clicked one of these buttons, and we now know what mood they have, maybe we want to render a specific message for them to see. So that's exactly what we'll do. So maybe what we're going to say is we're going to have a state in our application that's going to be the mood. And so, like I mentioned, objects in JavaScript are key value pairs. So we opened up a new object here. It's kind of spanning multiple lines, but you can imagine it all in one, kind of looking like this, right? So just one new object. We have a key called mood, and the value right now is, let's say, unknown. So maybe I'll say unknown. Just for right now, we have this as a string. So the mood is set to some string called unknown. And once I save this, this is how simple it is to create state within our application. So we might be interested in like kind of this syntax in what we're seeing here, like what is the this again, right? So remember with classes get a little tricky because you can have one class based like blueprint, right? So this is like the blueprint of the class, right? I'm trying to write some squiggles. This is like the blueprint of the class. And then what we use that blueprint for is to create other instances of the class. So we might have a couple different instances of this same class that are making use of this blueprint that we defined, right? So each of these classes are getting their information from this blueprint. But what happens with class-based, with classes in general, when you're working with data in that sense, is that you have, let me do it like this. So different instances, right? So essentially what happens with each of these class instances, right? You can imagine these yellow boxes as different instances of the same class, is each of these instances need to have some awareness of themselves so that they can say, hey, I'm this instance of this class, or I'm that instance of this class, right? And that's essentially what that keyword this is referring to. While we are working right now in our React component, we're defining this orange kind of blueprint. But just like we saw with the message component, we might write that blueprint once and then create multiple instances of that same component. But what happens is sometimes we're going to want to set specific variables based on the instance that the class is. So this particular first yellow block might have a specific instance of state value or props that it might want. And similar for those other two instances, right? So there might be instance specific changes we want to have happen on the classes. So in order to make use of instance variables or instance data, we use the this keyword in JavaScript to refer to that particular instance of the class, or in that particular instance of the object in general. So that's where that this keyword comes from when we look at the class and we see the, we saw this before when we were using props within our message component, right? If I go back to the class, right? This dot props, right? This dot props. We use that this keyword quite a bit in classes because we're trying to say, hey, this dot props dot sender is going to be reflected by that particular instance of the class, and versus the whole class as in and of itself, right? If I set a variable called sender inside of this class, then that means every instance of the class will have that same variable set. By using the this keyword, we're going to only have specific instances of the, component know what data it's referring to. So that's kind of just a side note of why we see this say this dot state. This means that each of those blocks would have their own state. And when we say this, we're saying we're setting it for a specific instance. So tangent, but we're still on track. So now we have this state value, these state values that are kind of set as a default. Whatever we set something up in the constructor for state, we call this the default state or the initial state. The initial state clearly is going to have some property called mood that is set to unknown. And we can see this inside of our render statement by just console logging it out. So I'm just going to console log out this dot state dot mood. So just like with props, we can use the state data that we're setting up inside of our component rendering process as well. So let me just save this, and inside of the console, I'm gonna open up the console. We're gonna see some of this now that this component is rendering. This was an old error, but let me just refresh this. Right, so we got that unknown printing back from mood.js 14. And so mood.js 14, line 14 clearly is this console log where we're saying, hey, print out the mood, the state of the mood, right? So unlike props, we can change this value. And so we're going to take a look at how we could change the state value. So we're going to take a look at how we can change the state as we continue to build out this component to do what we expect it to do logically with what's going on here. So couple of steps that we got done. First, we kind of define like a base UI for this component, right? Then we just created initial state of the component. So we set the initial state of this component mood to be unknown because we don't know what the mood is. And to set up a state, and we use this class-based component, created a constructor, and then defined a state variable called this.state, right? That is set to an object of key value pairs that right now only has one key. It's called mood, and one value is set to unknown. We can have multiple keys and values in here that would be part of this state. And then like we saw here, you can make reference to any of the state values by using the dot syntax and saying, hey, I want the value for mood that's inside of our state. And we call this in our render method. So I'm sure you can imagine, just like we were working with props the other day, we can use this state inside to do some interesting conditional things with our render statement. And that's exactly the direction we're going. It's like making some changes to this application that will impact what the user eventually is going to see. So next step we're going to do is kind of wire up these buttons, talking about a little bit more about like events in JavaScript and how events are handled within JavaScript. So like I told you before, JavaScript is useful for responding to all types of events in HTML. And there's a list of common events in HTML, right? Things like the page loading, things like someone pressing a specific key, things like someone like hovering their mouse over a specific thing, pointing their mouse at something, or clicking something, right? So buttons, most HTML elements have these events kind of pre-built onto them, right? So when you're working with JavaScript, it's important to know, hey, what HTML event am I trying to trigger? And then you can respond to those events by creating event listeners an event handler functions that we kind of did when we did our tic-tac-toe build of like, there was we used the onClick to respond to whenever the divs, the squares were being clicked by the user. And very similarly to HTML with these different HTML DOM events, React has built in JavaScript corresponding events that get triggered based on these different events, these different HTML events in a JavaScript context. So for all of these different HTML events that exist, so like drags and drops and loads and whatever, right? Clicks, all of these different types of events that happen over time, right? The HTML has like ways to respond to this. So let's look at the click. So I put a click. So whenever something like a button, right? The buttons have the ability to call some JavaScript whenever a click is happening. And this is the default HTML syntax. But what's cool about React is that it builds on top of the default HTML syntax so that you can call these same events using JavaScript. The only difference is it's written a little bit differently. So whereas this button has this lowercase onClick that gets passed some function to call in HTML, in JavaScript is very similar, but the big difference between the JavaScript versions for these, so like imagine if we were writing this with JSX versus HTML, the biggest difference is that most times the names of these attributes or these attributes that we're passing in are not going to be lowercase like this. They're going to be camel case. So that would be like lowercase o, capital C kind of thing. So that's exactly what happens when you start writing, like, so we have this button JSX element, right? So it's not technically HTML. So we can't just write this like this, but we can take a good influence from how would I do this in HTML and then translate it to React. So for instance, I want to have this button respond to clicks. I know from looking at this HTML example that buttons typically have this onClick handler. Well, I'm just going to assume that for React, but instead of writing this in HTML, I'm going to write this in JavaScript, camel case, which is like this, right? So onClick with a capital C versus onClick with a lowercase c. And in doing that, right, I'm just going to assume that the button will call this onClick attribute as it when it kind of gets clicked on. But similarly to what I'm seeing the HTML do is I'm going to pass it some function that is going to respond to. So I'm going to show you kind of how you would do this in a JavaScript context, and then we'll compare it to what we're looking at with the HTML. So remember last time I was talking to y'all about how we can pass JavaScript into our JSX elements, like props or whatever other attributes, by opening a curly brace. And inside of the curly brace, we can pass a JavaScript object. So it turns out that functions are a JavaScript object. So I have a couple of options here. I can define a new function and like just kind of create a new function up top here that then I pass in, or I can like define a function inside of this curly brace and pass it that way. Just so it is a little bit easier for you all to read, I'm gonna do it the former way. So I'm just gonna write out a new function and then pass it into our buttons onClick handler. So to do that, what I'll do is I'm going to create a new function called handle click. And I'm actually going to set this equal to an arrow function. I've kind of told y'all about this before, how typically I like to use arrow functions when I'm working with my with JavaScript in general, it's helpful, but specifically when you're working with classes, it's really helpful to define your functions as arrow functions. So you don't have to worry about a couple of small syntactic things related to that whole thing about instances and what instance of the class is calling this function, et cetera, et cetera. It just is easier to just use arrow functions. So I'm just gonna hope and pray that you use arrow functions. And if you don't, I'll make sure to like kind of give some resources for understanding the whole way to write this with like regular functions as well. But arrow functions just make your life easier. So I'm just gonna let you all know that now. So I'm gonna define this as an arrow function. Matter of fact, I could define all of these as arrow functions by just kind of, you know, changing it up like that. Even the constructor, I could do, you know, make this an arrow function if I wanted to. But for the sake of, I don't actually know if I can do the constructor like that. But for the sake of this, I'm just gonna just leave the handle click as the arrow function because it's a new function that's not tied to the class. But basically, I'm gonna have our button, when this click happens, I want it to call this handle click function. So what I'm gonna do is inside of here, just kind of console log tapped and save that. And so then in this on click function, I'm just gonna say, whenever this button is clicked, I want it to call this dot handle click. And this dot handle click is this arrow function that I defined up here. And so hopefully whenever this first button gets clicked, we see, matter of fact, instead of making a console log, I'm just gonna make an alert so that I don't have to pull up the console, I can just see it. So let's go back to our little app, refresh, make sure we refresh, click, and cool. So clearly this button is now working, right? And just to recap that, what's going on was with the button, just like every other HTML element has certain event properties that you can trigger, right? So we looked at all those different events. One of those events that you can look for is the click, right? So like you might be thinking, how do I respond to a click on a button, right? And then something might like send you over to this resource that's talking about handling clicks with buttons and how buttons have an on-click property in HTML. Well, with React, all of those things have been ported over to JavaScript for us. And so all the elements are now JSX elements that you can make use of. The properties are transferred over as well for the most part, for events especially. But the difference is, instead of calling it with lowercase kind of HTML-like syntax, we would call it with camel case for like this JavaScript syntax, so that we know that this is a React JavaScript function, right? So hovering over this, we see this is not an HTML function. This is a React DOM attribute that's tied to some JavaScript for handling clicks. So corresponds to the same thing in HTML, but remember, this is JavaScript that we're looking at. Then last thing I did was, whenever you're starting to work with events, and we're going to work with event handling functions all the time, and a couple of more and a bunch of the sessions coming up. But just for the sake of showing you this example, I have this on-click function that is calling another function called handle click. Handle click is clearly running just an alert, right? It's just, hey, run this alert with saying tapped or something. So now that I know that this is working, I think that I'm in a good position to change some stuff around with now how this application is going to work in general. So instead of showing this alert, maybe what I want to do is, when this button for feeling good gets pressed, we're going to change this message for our users. And this is going to come back to where we're going to start messing around with the state of our application. Right now, we're looking at the state of the app is unknown, but maybe what we want to do is change the state so that now we know, hey, this button just got clicked. The state should be saying feeling good or something, right? So instead of this, what we might want to do is figure out a way to change something that will eventually change kind of the message that's showing up for our user. So one of the things that we just created was an initial state for for our application. We have a mood state that is currently set to unknown, maybe I'd argue we want to change this state now that this button is getting clicked so that the mood is no longer set to unknown, but is set to something like good or something, right? So in order to change state in React components, you can make use of a very specific function that is defined in React classes. Again, this is defined in class-based components. It's called set state. It's a function that's built into React classes. So the set state function, you would call like this dot set state, which tells React to change the state. Just like any function, we open parentheses like this, but the set state function basically takes a new state object. So here we have our initial state object, curly braces with the key and value. Our set state function takes a new object with the different state set on. So I'm just going to copy this initial state, paste it inside of this function. But instead of the mood being set to unknown, I'm going to set the mood to good. And I'm just going to set it to good like this. Cool. And let's see what happens now. So clearly, load the app, nothing really has changed. We have our message and our button. I click the button and nothing really has changed here. Let's just take a look at the console and see what happens in there. And if you see, we have kind of a couple interesting things going on. Well, let's just take a look at mood 12, 18, and I don't know where mood 12 is coming from. Let me just refresh this. Okay, cool. So when the app first loads, we have this unknown, we said the mood is set, the state of the mood is set to unknown, right? Then when clearly when we click this button, right, the state of the application changes. We get another console log from this render statement that is saying that the state now is set to good. And the that kind of just shows us that two things have happened. One is that our state of the application has changed, right? Our set state function was successful. But also, this kind of shows us another thing, which is that the render function ran again. Right, so just to confirm this, I'm going to put another console log in here that says inside render, right? And when I refresh this page, clearly you can see inside render, first time, it says unknown, right? Then I click feeling good inside the render again, and then now it says it's good. So clearly something's going on where we're rendering this component twice. And it's what's happening is that when the component renders the second time, the state has clearly changed to be good. So this kind of goes into a very interesting thing you need to know about React components, which is that React components typically render one time. They don't render multiple times by default. The only time a component is going to re-render is when a component either changes the state, like internal to the component, the state changes, or the component receives some changing props, like the props that the component has are now new. And because those props are new, the component has to re-render to kind of make use of those new props. The fact that components re-render when state changes is what makes React powerful enough to handle kind of these conditional rendering tasks. And some of what we're going to see as we continue building this application of now that our component is re-rendering with a new state, clearly now we might be able to do some conditional rendering even at this point, right? Where we have one button for feeling good, and we're going to wire this up to just make sure now we can change some stuff here. So now that we have this state.mood kind of being set initially and then changed at another point, we're going to just keep going with this idea that this state.mood is a variable that we can use to do what we were doing last session, which is some conditional rendering on this component. So instead of just returning this default kind of simple message, this is our message for our users, now I'm going to want to do some interesting kind of JavaScript here to see, hey, what is the mood? Maybe I should say this message, or maybe I should return something different for our users based on the person's mood. So that's exactly what I'm going to do now, which is instead of having this div and this first div kind of return this simple heading, I'm going to make it so that it does some JavaScript functions to do some logic and to take a look at what is the state of the application. And based on that, this message will return. So we're going to do what we call conditional rendering for this message. So what I'm going to do now is just create another message here. I'm going to say render message. I'm just going to name a new function, make it the arrow function to keep myself consistent. And the role of this function is to check the state to determine what message to render. Right? So how are we gonna do that? Well, let's just do a simple if else. So if this dot state dot mood is, let's say, is equal to good, right? I'm gonna want to do something here. Mood is good. Else, maybe if else, maybe I don't have a mood, right? So for right now, seeing as I'm kind of only working on one button right now, I'm gonna let's just work on one button first, and then we'll work on the other one. So let's say in this case that this handle click went through, the state says that the mood is good. I'm gonna want to return a message that is going to be a little bit more specific instead of just this is our message for our users. So I'm going to say something like return. So I'm going to end up I got two options. I can either change the text inside of here, or I can just return this whole element. I'm going to just change the text because that will mean that I can keep the h1 tags here, but then essentially this function is going to have to be responsible for returning the text element that will be inside of that JSX. So I'm going to just return a message that says, glad to know you're feeling good. Else, I'm going to return I'm going to return maybe I'm going to return something like, hey, how are you feeling today? So if we know that the mood is good, I'm going to return this. Else, and you know what I can do is very specifically set this to, I'm going to change this around a little bit so that our if else is a little bit more specific to what the state changing thing is. So let's say if this state mood is instead of it being set equal to good to start, let's change this around to say if this state mood is equal to unknown, right? So our default state, right? I'm just gonna swap what was in this if and with what was in the else. I'm gonna say mood is unknown, and I'm gonna return the hey, how are you feeling today? Right? Else the mood, we know that the mood is not unknown, right? And since the mood is not unknown, we're going to assume we know something about the mood, and we're going to just assume for right now that the mood is good, right? Of course, I could add some logic that checks. I could say else if like mood is equal to good. But for right now, let's just kind of run it like this and see what happens. So now I have this render message function, which essentially is looking at the mood, the this.state, right? So it's using the this.state that I had defined earlier and checking mood to see if it's unknown or what, right? And now I have this function that's returning some JSX text is also considered JSX. So you want to remember that when you're kind of thinking about using functions creatively within your React applications. But in general, right? So now I have this message, this H1 message that says, this is our message for our users. So I'm going to change this around. And instead of just returning this message here, I'm going to return some JavaScript. So I'm going to open my curly braces inside of this element. And I'm going to say this dot render message. So note that in this instance, I have to call this method with parentheses. The reason why is because I need this function to run when this render method gets called. I want this function to run, so I call it with parentheses. The reason I didn't put parentheses here is because when this renders, I don't necessarily want this button to like call handle click. I want this button to call handle click once it gets clicked on. So I'm just passing this function so that the button knows, hey, when you are ready, call this function. Versus here, I'm saying, hey, when you start rendering, I need you to call this function immediately so that we see something. So that's just kind of a side note on why there's some parentheses and why there's no parentheses there. So I'm gonna save this and cool. So now that I kind of added this JavaScript in here, this H1 is going to be set based on what returns from this render message. So if the state of the mood is unknown, we're going to see it say, hey, how are you feeling today? Else, when the state is set to something that's not unknown, it's going to say, hey, glad to know you're feeling good, right? So I got rid of that other button just so we can see this example make a lot of sense. So here we see our message change to, hey, how are you feeling today, right? And that's not happening specifically that's not like I hard coded it here in this H1, right? I actually am calling this function. Clearly, we're calling this function, and inside of this function, it's running this conditional. It's checking if this.state.mood is set to some specific variable, and clearly it is set to unknown because we're seeing, hey, how are you feeling today? But let's see what happens when I change this. So cool. Now when I click this button, it says glad to know you're feeling good, right? And nothing, the page didn't reload, nothing crazy had to happen, right? Let me restart it again. But first we have this interesting message. Then when I click the button, the message just changes. And this is one of the valuable things about using state in React is that our component is still rendering. Our component was rendered, but now that we're re-rendering the component, the only thing that changes is that component itself. The whole application doesn't need to refresh. There's no need for us to have to reload anything, right? This component is now smart enough to react to the changes that are happening based on these events on the DOM. And that's a little bit of where React gets that name, React, right? So we're able to more easily react to these changes happening on the DOM. So when this button gets clicked, clearly this message gets changed. So now let's add that other button and kind of extend the logic of this component a little bit to do a little bit more kind of interesting stuff with regards to the state. So clearly we're checking the state of if the state is unknown, which is our initial state. And our handle click is a function that we defined on one button that is set to feeling good, right? So let's bring in this other button. And, you know, similarly to the one above, we might want to add this handle click function to it. So I'm gonna just do that, right? But right now we're kind of gonna see something interesting, right? If I save this and I have feeling right? Hey, how are you feeling today? So I've just reloaded. So I'm gonna click feeling but oh, glad to know you're feeling good. Why is it doing that? Well, that's because our button is tied to the same handle click function. And currently our handle click function is not smart enough to say, hey, are you feeling good? Or did you click the good button or did you click the other button, right? One thing we could do is we could make a new function that says, like maybe we can change this to say, let's say on feeling good pressed. And that can be a new function. And we can maybe have another function that says on feeling pressed. And we say mood is right? So now we have two functions. One is on feeling good pressed and one is on feeling pressed. So I'm going to just change this from this dot handle click to this dot on feeling good pressed, and this dot on feeling pressed. And that might solve our issue to a degree, right? So now we have our feeling good is setting the state to good. On feeling we're setting the state to But now what I want to do is extend the logic in our message to kind of reflect that. So if this dot state dot mood is unknown, return, hey, how are you feeling today? Makes sense. Else, maybe else if, let's just say else, right? And then inside of this else, I could say if this dot state dot mood is equal to good, right? I can move this return into there, right? Else return, oh man, hope you feel better soon, right? So clearly we're doing just some more kind of nested logic here. If this dot state dot mood is equal to unknown, we're gonna say this. Else, we know that this dot state dot mood is not set to unknown. So if this dot state dot mood is set to good, we're gonna return this kind of feel good little message. Else, we know that, this is the same as if us saying else, like if this dot state dot mood is equal to but because we already know that this dot state dot mood is not set to unknown, which it's set to as a default, it's not set to good, because if it was set to good, it would have returned already. We're saying else, so this is the case that this dot state dot mood is set to equal to right? So I could make another conditional for this very specific case. If I had more cases, I might want to do this in general to like kind of make sure that my my conditional logic makes sense, right? But seeing as I know what the three options are, it's either unknown, good, or I don't really need to. I could just let this else kind of handle this for me. So the reason this conditional is going to work though is because all of these conditions have something it returns. If this is the state, we're going to return this. Else, we're going to either return this or return this. So there's all types of returns happening. So we're going to trust that everything is going to work out the right way. So just refresh to make sure everything's good. So, hey, how are you feeling today? I'm feeling good. Glad to know you're feeling good. I'm feeling Oh man, I hope you feel better soon. You know what? Something changed. I just made this app work. So I'm feeling good. You know what I'm saying? Like, glad to know you're feeling good. And clearly we can toggle between these things. And this is one of the valuable things about state as well, is now we created this ability for us to toggle what returns from this specific component, this mood component, based on something changing internal to it, right? The data that's changing is the state. We're changing what state of the application, what state are we set to? Is our mood good? Is our mood unknown? Or is our mood And like, based on what those states are, we clearly have some conditional logic that is responding to those different states and returning various messages that correspond to that particular state set to something specific. So what we're using this state variable for is very valuable, right? It's allowing us to have the component itself be aware of some data that is going to change. This data mood, we expect to change over time, like whether it's happening because a button is getting clicked, whether it's happening because a function returns, and once the function returns, it's calling set state and it's changing that various thing in and of itself, right? At the end of the day, something is going to happen that's going to change this value. And because this value is going to change, and we want our component to still be smart enough to render something at every step of the way, right? Clearly, we want to render the message no matter what. We use conditional rendering so that we have cases of like, hey, in this case, I want to render this, else I'm going to render this, or I'm going to render that. And this is where React kind of gets both fun and confusing. I can imagine for folks like, yo, what? Props, state, changing data, like, you know, conditional rendering. There's so much to it that can get very confusing very quick. So if you're looking at this, you're like, hey, I don't know what he did. Like, this don't make no sense. Trust me, it's okay. What you want to do though is try to walk through this code. I'm gonna push it up to GitHub real quick, but just take a look at what's happening at a big picture sense, which is we have 2 buttons. Those buttons are, once they get clicked, they're running a function. Each of them have their own function, and they're changing the state of our application, right? Just copy that in here too. And the way that state works, one more time, is we create an initial object, and you know, sometimes you might have this initial object set to, you might want to set it to a default value, right? And you can do that by setting up state in the constructor. But if I didn't necessarily want to initialize the state, I can also just run these set state functions inside of my component as it's rendering, and those functions will still work, right? If I didn't have mood defined and I still ran this function, this.setState mood, it'll just create a new variable on my state called mood. So sometimes you see people create an initial function for their initial object for their state data. Other times you might see people not make an initial variable, but change the value over time. As their application is kind of going through its life cycle and whatnot. So yeah, just kind of as a recap, this little app kind of is showing us the value of something like state, where, you know, this component is responding to different things changing, right? Once one of these buttons get clicked, we're gonna change the logic of change some data that's the component knows. That data being what mood is the user currently in, right? So click feeling good, and now because that state is selected, and clearly we're in the state where mood is set to good, that means in these conditionals, we're in this block of the if else's, right? Where this.state.mood is equal to good. And now we have a very specific message that returns from this render message function that is getting called inside of our render statement. And the valuable thing about this setup is React is still going to show whatever it needs to show. And this is where that idea of it being declarative comes into play, where we're saying, hey, you know, I want you to return, you're going to show some H1, but the content of what you're going to show, I'm going to tell you about it over time. Don't worry about it right now, but just know, hey, I'm going to show you, I'm going to send some data to you about what you should show, but you're going to be a heading, and you're going to show different messages based on some stuff, right? And then these buttons are what really determine what kind of state we're in, right? If we click one of them, we're in one state. If we click another, we're in a different state. And those different states are going to correspond to this message that gets returned from render message, which ultimately is getting called inside of our running application. And so, yeah, that is a little bit of state kind of information with React. Clearly, state is pretty fun and pretty powerful, a pretty powerful tool to add to our components. Again, the difference between state and props, right? Props are data that you pass into a component from its parent. So if I wanted to pass props into our mood component, right? I could define a prop. So maybe prop 1 and set it equal to something in here, right? Prop 2, right? Et cetera, et cetera. I can pass props down into components. And when the components have these props passed down to them, they can make use of them inside of themselves, right? I can console log, or, just like I'm using conditional rendering with state here, I can maybe use conditional rendering with the props. But it doesn't really make sense for the app to pass the mood to the component, right? We don't really care for the whatever the app is passing down. What we want is for some interactions in our component internal to this mood component to change things up, right? So the buttons getting clicked, or in another sense, maybe it's like maybe your state of your application is tied to like the position of certain elements on the screen. So you might be responding to drag and drops. The state can change for almost anything that is happening with JavaScript. So that being the case, you just want to be aware of starting to think about what data am I going to be concerned with in these applications? Am I going to be concerned with the state changing because like something is happening internal to the component, or am I going to be passing some data into the component that is going to be defined from another component, right? Props are cool because one component can pass props to another component. So in our previous example, we saw our app component was passing props to the mood component. So that's kind of how components talk to each other, is via props. That one component can tell another component about some data by defining props on that other component, right? So two components can talk to each other via props, but a component can talk to itself, and like, for lack of better words, by using state. And that conversation of like, what's happening now, what should I show now, or in this case or that case, is what we use state a lot for. Internal to the component, because all of this is happening internal to the component, has nothing to do with the app, has nothing to do with any other component in this kind of hierarchy. It's just the mood component is smart. And stateful components, which, like I mentioned, we call components that are using state, we call kind of smart components, right? Because they're doing some smart, interesting thing with the data that they're aware of, and manipulating kind of what the user sees based on stuff like that. And yeah, these are two very important tools to kind of add to your arsenal as you start building out these components. In our next session, we're going to talk more. We're going to do one more example of using state and props, and then kind of more practical example of talking between components and sharing information from one to the next. Like I mentioned, when you're sharing information, you typically will use props. But if information is changing internal to a component, you'll typically use state. So there's some interesting ways that those two things get connected. If you want to kind of get ahead on that conversation and just kind of start thinking about it, we kind of walk through a couple of these things in this section of concepts. So you could take a look, learn more about state from this section, state and lifecycle, from the React main concepts. We also talked a little bit about handling events. So if you wanted to get a little bit more insight on like the on-click and how we did that, definitely recommend reading through this handling event section on the React docs. Specifically, all of the stuff about forms are going to be really helpful to you, because we use forms a lot in websites. So knowing how to write forms and work with forms and the changing state and stuff happening with forms is going to be helpful for you. Understanding everything we were just talking about, changing state and changing props and responding to event handles and stuff like this. And actually, this is a good example of earlier. Remember, I said, if you work with arrow functions, it kind of saves you some work. This is an example of another component, right? This is a class-based component. Here's the constructor. But in the render function, you can see they also have a button, and they're on click, and very similar to ours. In that button on click, they have another function called this.handleClick that is going to get called by this button. But when you go to this.handleClick, you can see this.handleClick is handleClick itself is a function written in the old JavaScript function syntax. So name parentheses, curly braces. Because it's written like this, in this old JavaScript way, it's what happens that you have to do in order to make this function work is you have to do this process called binding, which is inside a constructor. You have to very specifically write this line out that says this.handleClick, which is the name of this function. And you end up running this function called bind, where you're binding the this to to this particular function. Now, this is a might be very confusing for you if you're first started with React. What is this whole bind this thing and da da da? And again, it's all related to this idea of the classes and instances that I've been talking to you about. The this keyword is referring to that particular instance of the class, but with functions, there's kind of this tricky thing where when a function is getting triggered, it might call itself in a way that is not anticipated. And so you need to end up binding you need to give the function awareness of what instance of the class is that function a part of. And so in essence, when you're working with regular defined functions, you have to do this line of bind this or whatever. But the beautiful thing about arrow functions, and I'll go back to our example, when you create it as an arrow function, you don't have to do any of that. You just, it already knows about that stuff when you define it as an arrow function, which is why I was saying, working with arrow functions kind of makes your life easier. But you'll see that more when you walk through the docs and kind of get this example from here of what's going on in there. And lastly, after talking about events, we've been talking about conditional rendering a whole lot these last couple classes. So, reading about the conditional rendering a little bit more will make this process a little bit more make sense to you. And yeah, I would say, dang, we are basically done with some of these main concepts. If I were you, I'd read all the way through section 9. And if you read through section 9, it's gonna really kind of illuminate a lot of what we were just talking about, just so you know kind of how to pair what we're talking about right now to some of the stuff in the docs. And yeah, appreciate y'all and for the time. And I will stick around, answer a couple questions, but thank y'all so much for a dope class.